Every time we say goodbye, my dear, I don't know why it's so unclear. Your mouth says go away, but your body's telling me to stay. I don't know just what to do.
Hello and welcome to There and Then. My name is Tom Gutteridge. Thank you for joining us. This is a podcast where we discuss the works of one Canadian author, my grandfather, Don Gutteridge, and find out what inspires him, what inspired him to write, and just generally spend some time together. We're really glad to share that with you all. This week, Grandpa and I are discussing 3 of his novels, 2 of which were written in the 1970s, and 1 of which was written in the late 1990s. So there's actually a little gap in between the first 2 and the third. The novels in chronological order are Bus Ride, All in Good Time, and Bewilderment, a novel of the Great Depression. I think these are works Grandpa treasures. They're certainly not his most well-known, and they're not always the most reader-friendly of his work. I think the poetry it's just so pleasant to read. These take a little more work, but it's worth it, and they're good. These novels cover a period of time ranging from the mid-1930s to the late 1940s, and all are set in the town of Point Edward, Ontario, Grandpa's hometown, and a recurring character, if you will, in his work. This is a good one. I think you'll enjoy it. It's a long one, and it gets off to a bit of a strange start. So Grandpa and I went to a new mic setup, and so he didn't actually realize we were recording for the first couple of minutes, and that's on me. I guess I didn't tell him. But so you'll be sort of dropped into the middle of a conversation for the first few minutes. Just stick with it, because it's a good one. You get a little family history, too. Well, without any further ado, let's go to my conversation with Don.
Stop me saying no, no, no. I guess I'll stay on by a little longer.
Yeah.
Born in Dearborn, Michigan.
Mm-hmm.
So we have an American branch
Oh.
of the family, the Smiths from Michigan.
Huh.
Yeah, I'd hate to go looking for a William Smith
Yeah.
on Ancestry. It'd be 8,000 of them.
It's amazing how much they can hem down on places like Ancestry, but
Yeah,
William Smith would be a challenge.
Yeah, yeah.
Huh.
And of course, that's the grandma who was first prize in a craps game
Right.
and married a man named William Campbell, and he fathered a child, my Uncle Roy Campbell, and then they divorced a year later,
Yeah.
and then she married my grandfather McWaters.
Oh. And your grandfather McWaters is the fellow that was murdered, right?
Yeah, and
Yeah.
He's in the canon.
Up on the other side of the room.
Yeah, on the other side of the room.
Yes.
That's the only photo we have of him.
Yeah.
So I treasure that. But
He lived with you for part of your childhood, right? Correct?
he was murdered in June of 1938.
Oh, okay.
I would have turned 2 that September.
Right.
But he lived with us. So if you could remember as a child, I certainly would have known him, but I didn't have any particular memory.
Yeah,
of
you
him.
weren't making
And
memories.
my
at
mother
that point.
never talked much about him because of the murder.
Well, it does sort of cast a bit of a pall over the
yeah,
proceedings.
she finally told me about the murder when I was much older. But
Yeah.
like quite often, you spend a lot of time talking about it. But her mother died when she was 14, so there was a lot of trauma there. So I didn't get much family history. So
Yeah.
I'm glad we could go over it. That's been part of the the joy of these sessions.
Absolutely. Well, and it sort of didn't occur to me how little I knew until you and I started talking about it. And I've learned so much. And, you know, I guess we're coming up, not quite, but we're coming up on a year since we started doing this. And I would say I certainly know a lot more now than I did a year ago.
Well, I'm hoping the boys will listen to these and learn the family history as well.
Yeah, I think they will. And I think it'll be nice for whatever generations come next too, because I mean your body of work is so large that I'm glad you and I have had a chance to parse it a little bit.
There's what I'm going to give you. You see that row there?
Yeah.
That row there.
Yep.
And that little row above it.
Mm-hmm.
That's all 55 of my books, and I'm going to make you custodian of them.
Yep.
I'm also going to give you these 5 binders here, which contain all reviews over the last 50 years.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Nice.
All the reviews. So if you were ever to do anything with my work, those reviews would be very, very useful in giving you an insight to how I was viewed and received and how the books were received as you go along through the decades.
Gives you some context for the work as it came out.
There's probably a couple hundred reviews in there, and I'm still getting reviews, and I've been very lucky. Well, let's start rather than...
Yeah, well, we've been recording, so...
Oh, we've been recording. I do.
It's so simple to set it up this way.
It's so simple. It's just wonderful.
Yeah. It's funny how you can realize you've got the potential.
Okay.
And then, so we've got all of that.
Well, fire away. We'll back into some of this stuff anyway.
I like it. So, hey everybody, welcome. I'm here again with my grandfather, Don Gutteridge. Hey, Grandpa.
Good morning, or good afternoon, yeah.
It's been a little while since we've sat down.
It has been, and it's really nice to see you again, and nice to be in this room together.
Absolutely. Grandpa and I have just been chewing the fat a little on some of the family history and looking at Grandpa's collection of work. Now, what we're going to be talking about today is a group of 3 novels that, I guess really what they do is they complete the Point Edward timeline. Right. They bridge the gap between Lily's story and Summer's Idol, Winter's Descent.
Yeah.
Chronologically speaking, a couple of them are early, and then the most recent one is just about 15 years old.
Yeah, the 2000 one, yeah.
So the books we're going to talk about today are Bus Ride, which is a novel from 1974, All in Good Time, which is released in 1979, and then Bewilderment, a novel of the Great Depression, which was released in the year 2000.
In the year 2000, right.
So, the very first of the bunch is Bus Ride.
Right, which I reread this morning.
Yeah?
And had a few good laughs.
Yeah. It's a funny book in general. It's, no, is this your first novel?
Yes.
Okay.
And that's why it has flaws, which we can discuss.
What got you moving in the direction of writing a novel?
Well, I'll tell you where it all started.
Mm-hmm.
It started in The Village Within, my first book of lyric poems.
Yeah.
And the second poem in the book is called Numbering.
Yeah.
And I go through and introduce the characters of my town. And they include Cap Harness, Duffy Duffield, Happy Butler, Old Cap Garvey, Silent George, who never stopped talking, Effie Free, Charlie Levin, Butch McCord, and, as I say at the end of the poem, and the red-headed Sykes and the black-haired Barkers who peopled our village with preschoolers, softball teams, Sunday school picnics in Canatara Park, who gave us so freely the prodigality of their frequent wombing, their athletic lusts, the multicolored, many-faceted repetitions of their own exuberance. And all my work stems from the first volume on that village.
Yeah.
And there are other village poems in here as well. And of course the title is evocative, The Village Within.
Mm-hmm. Well, it really, and this is something we'll touch on towards the end of today, but that, it really is the arc that a lot of your work has followed since. Like, you laid the groundwork for it in, was that in 1968, The Village Within?
It was published in 70, but that was probably written about 1965 or 66, before
wow.
I started in on Rial,
Yeah, okay.
which was 68. These are pre-Rial, but they weren't published until after Rial, because I hadn't got them together as a whole collection. I was still sending out to little magazines and getting them published, and I finally put them together, and Fred Cogswell published them in 1970.
So we're looking at 50 years ago.
Yeah.
Is where it all started.
Yeah.
Wow. So how does that lead to Bus Ride?
Well, I started to become a novelist in 1962.
Mm-hmm.
I wrote a novel about my experiences in the gold mill up at Red Lake, where I worked one summer when I was in university.
Right.
And I sent it off to Jack McClellan, because in those days you didn't use agents. You just sent the book in, and Jack or one of his friends read the book. It was all so simple.
Mm-hmm.
And he kept it for a couple of months, but I got a nice reply from him. He said, "It's a very good book, but there's no dialogue in it. We can't publish it without dialogue."
Right.
So I thought, how in the world can I be a novelist if I can't write dialogue?
Yep.
So I dropped the novel. I said, I'm going to be a poet. And I started writing those mid-sized narratives, and then Rial, and then all of the other ones that followed.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was a poet. But in 1970, the summer of 1970, for the first time in 5 years, I was not teaching summer school.
Right.
And I had done my academic work in May and June.
Mm-hmm.
And so I had, for the first time, a whole summer to myself.
Right.
And so I sat out in the backyard, and I thought, I'm going to try to go back and write a novel.
Right.
And it's going to be about the village.
Mm-hmm.
And it's going to be about my dad, in a sense, in terms of the arc of the narrative. It's not really... He's not the character, but it was him becoming a local hockey star and getting an invitation to the Red Wings and all that stuff that I put into Bill's narrative arc.
Yep.
And so I thought, okay, I've got a character, I've got a story. And it's going. Initially, I thought this will be a typical coming of age story. He's 19 years old, so it's about growing up.
Yep.
But in a way, it's what I call a reverse coming of age story. Because usually in coming of age, you go through trials and tests, and then you go out into the world a strong person.
Yeah, that's the trope of the thing.
That's the trope of the coming of age story. But in this story, Bill wants out.
Yes.
But in the end, he accepts the village as his life, his existential life.
Mm-hmm. And it's through that sort of the crucible of that. The titular Bus Ride is like this sort of, it is almost like a forge where you see everybody gets broken down and they end up in the form they find at the end of the novel.
Yeah, that's a very good way of putting it, Tom. Yeah, you've read it very, very well.
Well, and that's what a lot of the reviews of Bus Ride were, that it really all does lead up to the final Bus Ride, which we'll talk about. And some felt that the denouement was not long enough, that they would have liked a little more time to soak it all in. But
yeah, that's right. Yeah, I remember that review. It cuts off very quickly.
Yeah. You sort of, it's this great sort of wild, frenetic piece of writing.
But that review did catch more of the book than some of the other reviews, even though it was a short review. But, you can tell whether someone has got on the wavelength of your book.
Yeah.
And so I'd call that a wavelength review. And every author hopes that the reader actually, especially with comedy, comedy is very difficult to review.
Yes.
Because there's all kinds of shades of comedy.
Yes.
And in some ways, Bus Ride could be considered a dark comedy.
Yeah.
because I have a lot of serious stuff in there.
Absolutely.
Because to be honest, I put a lot of stuff in those little books.
Mm-hmm.
They really are compact. I create all kinds of characters, and there's all kinds of sub-narratives going on and subplots going on.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm trying to create the picture of a village 80 years ago,
Mm-hmm.
when Canada was so different from the one you grew up in.
Yeah.
I mean, what I'm trying to capture, not only here but in the other books, which we'll talk about, is a village, a pre-war village,
Mm-hmm.
in which Canada had not come of age yet. We didn't really become a modern country until 1967, and that's when the great renaissance of poetry and novels and Gordon Lightfoot and popular music and the tragic hip and all
Leonard Cohen.
Yeah, and Leonard Cohen, all those people
Pierre
started
Berton.
within a 10-year period. They burst through.
It is amazing
And-
how much of that.
But everything was much simpler.
Yeah.
Politics was local.
Mm-hmm.
And I have a lot of politicians in these three novels.
Yes.
And of course, I can't help satirizing them because they are they're so full of themselves.
They lend themselves well to satire. The one type of character, and this is on, and I'm probably in a somewhat unique position in that I've probably read a lot of these books more thoroughly than many people. Like, I probably have read more of your fiction in the last year than most people would in a year.
Exactly.
And the character that you excel at creating is the pompous figure of authority.
My favorite is Jefferson Dearborn Stagg.
Which one is he from?
He's from the last novel,
Bewilderment.
The Bewilderment.
Yes.
He's the mayor of Point Edward.
Yes.
Who's a pompous ass.
Yes.
He has a 300-pound daughter, and
Yes.
daughter of the American Revolution.
Yes.
And that has only one really comic scene, and they are both in it. But and William McAdory, and
Yes.
McLeister, and all of those characters. I get them mixed up myself. They slide from one novel to the other.
Mm-hmm.
There are characters in Bus Ride that we see 5 years later.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that was the thing. I had read... I hadn't read Bewilderment before. I had read Bus Ride and All in Good Time when I was younger. That's wrong. I had never read Bus Ride. I had read All in Good Time, but I had not connected that those were the same story.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was interesting to me as I started to dive into All in Good Time, was that we are looking at a continuation of the same story with some differences. Now, this actually gets into something I wanted to ask you about, and it's something we've talked about. In Bus Ride, you're using basically an omniscient narrator.
Oh, yes.
That is something that you do not use after this book.
Never again. No, it was a mistake to do it in the first place. You see, I had never written a novel.
Yeah.
And I must say that in the 60s I devoted to poetry. I devoured poetry. I had, by 1980, I had 5 shelves full of, you can see those slim little poetry books up there.
Oh, yeah.
I had over 450 of those.
Really?
I immersed myself in poetry.
Mm-hmm.
And I read Margaret Lawrence and Alice Munro and Timothy Findlay and Robertson Davies. But those were not a lot of books. I mean, in terms of volume, I hadn't a lot of models to work from.
Yeah.
So my model was actually Tom Jones and Henry Fielding from the 18th century,
Yep.
where they used... So I thought it would be fun to write in a Tom Jones style.
Mm-hmm.
And I just made it up. I hadn't no real profound insight into what I was about to do.
Right.
And if I revised the book, I would take it out.
Yeah. That's where you land. You wouldn't do it that way again?
Right, because I can hear Beverly Slope and my agent saying, "You don't need that. The characters stand on their own. Get rid of that stuff."
Well, and one of the things that these novels are possibly the best example of it, although Summer's Idol gets close, is how you're able to flesh out narrative through the voices of characters. I would Beverly, the subjective Beverly assessment's probably right in that you don't necessarily need it.
No.
But the opening of Bus Ride is interesting. It's so unlike any of your other writing.
Right.
That I find it very enjoyable to read it, but you feel like it detracts from the effectiveness of the book, or
I'd say I'm neutral.
Yeah.
But I would think it's a problem for reviewers.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, when you're a young writer, you're looking for reviews and informative reviews, even if they're not positive.
Mm-hmm.
And I would keep saying, they haven't got on the wavelength yet.
Mm-hmm.
You know, in fact, I reread some of the reviews.
Yeah.
I got my binder out and reread some of the reviews, and hardly any of them mentions how funny they are.
Yep.
Why wouldn't a reviewer say, if you want a good laugh, read the bus ride sequence?
Mm-hmm. Well, and I guess part of it, and the way I see it is, the comedy is not. It's not like first order comedy. It's not like a pie in the face. Like it's it's all very situational.
Yeah.
And so you have to do a bit of legwork to really have the joke resonate. And I think that it's a better kind of comedy, but it's maybe a little less accessible.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I just look at the Reeve as I was rereading it.
Mm-hmm.
Everything he says, I find really quite funny. And of course, I loved him so much. He ended up in the next in the next novel. I didn't get enough of him the first time round.
And so I never was 100% clear. So the Reeve, is he the mayor? Who is he?
He's the Reeve, which is the old title for mayor that they only changed about 10 years ago.
Okay. I guess this was sort of, because municipal politics is a big part of, actually all three of these books.
Yeah, right.
So the Reeve is just a term for mayor.
Yeah, the Point Edward now has a mayor, but they had
they
had a Reeve all the years I grew up. And that went back to 1848 when the term was invented.
Huh.
By Robert Baldwin, the premier of that period. And he found the office in medieval governance.
Uh-huh.
There was a local county official called a Reeve.
Right.
And he said, we're going to call the municipal heads of villages and towns Reeves.
Huh.
In order to get a mayor, you had to have a city.
Oh.
But that's how again, those were much simpler times.
Yeah.
Now, of course, we have mammoth cities like Chatham, Kent, where there's one council for the whole county, and you can't sort of call up your local councillor who lives down the street and get your sidewalk fixed and all that sort of thing.
Right. The one thing I found effective about the thing I liked about that omniscient narrator is mainly that initial sequence, because the thing that it accomplishes is showing, and maybe this is informed by everything that came later, but it does do a good job of sort of positioning the narrative. It shows you Point Edward, it shows you the surrounds. That's right. It does. Yeah, you're right. It shows you where the action is to take place.
Yeah.
And in light of the fact that so much work has chronologically come after this, set in Point Edward, I enjoy it on that level, because I think you're, even though you probably weren't aware of it at the time, you were setting up this huge, like, oeuvre. Yeah.
Yeah. Once I got into the village, and of course I drew on village characters for my models. They're not complete characterizations, but Redmond the grocer
Yep.
appears in a couple of novels,
Mm-hmm.
and he's based on Easton Burgess.
Yep.
And in fact, in one of the books, there's a Burroughs Market, which is based on Burgess's Market.
Mm-hmm. Was that the one that burned down? That was just across from your home? Yeah.
And then we have the local cop appears as a comic figure.
Mm-hmm.
And we had one policeman, and so on, and so what I'm trying to do with the novel is present a very particular village,
Mm-hmm.
and also a village that will be more universal, that will travel,
Mm-hmm.
so that if I can do that, I feel the novel has been successful.
Yep.
Because, as you know, having gone there, the Point is a very particular place.
Yeah, it's a really tiny little point on the map.
It's not a sleepy little farm village.
No.
It's surrounded by a city that has tried to annex it 5 times in 100 years.
Yep.
It sits right across the river from the most powerful country in the world, where everything is bigger and better.
Mm-hmm.
We used to go to my aunt and uncle who lived in Port Huron. Their house was big. They had a brand new car.
Yep.
They had the first television set ever produced.
Really?
Yeah, they had the first television set. That was 1948, if you can believe that.
Whoa.
Yeah,
Okay.
tiny little television set, which we used to go over to see.
Probably weighed 300 pounds.
Yeah, and they didn't boast. They didn't have to. Everything, when you went over there across the river from Little Point Edwards, surrounded by a big city, surrounded by a huge, boastful, pompous country like the United States.
Yep.
And that's why the U.S. characters are satirized, because the people are trying to cope with them. In Bus Ride, it only appears as Danilchuk.
Mm-hmm.
But in the next 2 novels, the American cadre of people are heavily satirized, but they are also the enemy. They are what makes us feel small, and the need to escape and find out who we are.
Yeah, and so this I mean, what you've just said touches on a few different things I've wanted to focus on, but the one that is sort of a natural progression from that is, I mean, in these first 2, so in Bus Ride and in All in Good Time, hockey is a huge sub-theme, and it's sort of it's almost a canvas on which the narrative is painted at times.
Right.
Danilchuk, just for the listener, is an American hockey player who's a big martial
Enforcer
fellow that is, he becomes the focus of the town's ire, really.
Yeah.
And that the idea of the Americans as this monolith.
And it's really their inferiority complex, which they put onto him and people like him, and so on. And
so what did that come from anywhere specific in your experience, or was that a conscious device?
My dad was a hockey player, and hockey is our national game. So those are your 2 sort of touchstones that I use. I always admired my dad and read his press clippings. He had a whole scrapbook of his clippings, and so on. He was very, very well known all around southwestern Ontario as a great hockey player. But also, if you want to have a hockey game, as I do in the second novel, with the people from across the way, you've got a ready-made set of themes. And of course, the treachery of the U.S. And it reminds me, I don't know whether you've read The Clockmaker.
I don't think I have.
By Halliburton.
No, I can't say I have.
It's a wonderful, you'd love it. It's a satire, a Nova Scotia satire written way back in the 1830s, but it's a wonderful book. an American clockmaker from Boston comes up in the book, and chapter by chapter bamboozles and outwits the yokel locals.
Okay, yep.
And
It's
that book
it's
had
like a Music Man kind of situation.
that book had a profound effect on me, and sort of gets into some of the kind of stuff I do with the Americans taking advantage of the naivete of the Canadians, who of
Yes.
course are their own worst enemies. because
Yes.
they fall for all of these things.
Yes, it's so funny that the Americans in this novel and in All in Good Time are definitely set up as the other,
The other, yeah, that's a good way of putting it.
but there's some malice, but it's funny how it's more a reflection of the characters themselves rather than the Americans
Yeah.
actually being malicious.
Well, the American women, the two American women characters, one in each of the first two novels, I love them. I mean, they're so full of life. I mean, they're satirized,
Yeah,
but I love them and I try to present them as really powerful women,
yeah,
and
and
they're using their sexuality, of course, in powerful ways.
and definitely giving them agency. That
Yeah.
they are their own character.
They're their own characters. That's right. And of course, there's lots of that in Bus Ride.
Well, yeah, they're in both of those novels
They're
too.
in both of the novels. There's a different one. Audrey, I think, is the name of the one in the second novel.
Yes,
And
that's accurate.
I've forgotten the name of that gal in Bus.
I'm blanking on it too, but
Yeah, I just read it this morning and I've forgotten already.
Wow.
But our agency is the best way to describe what I was trying to do with them, and in some ways, even the American politicians satirize. They're only taking advantage of the ambitions and stupidity of the other local Point Edward politicians.
Yes.
Or Sarnia politicians.
Yeah.
And so you can kind of forgive them a little bit as well.
Well, and the another thing you're generating a lot in these Canadian politicians is just it's just the hubris of the hubris and the bloviating that they bring to their public persona. It's very satisfying when a character like that gets what's coming to them, even if it's supposed to be your hometown favorite.
Yeah. William Dougal McAdory took his 3 names and went back to the city.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. So the other things that you start to see in Bus Ride that you see through all of these novels, and oddly enough, you see it in Lily's story a lot in various eras. But the idea of when you're looking at Point Edward through the lens of Bus Ride, you start to see some of the places that become emblematic in the work in the other novels. But in Bus Ride, you see the rink. You're starting to see you working with the theme of the bridge a lot, the
Right.
flats, the hockey. Yeah, so the hockey rink, the flats, the bridge, Canatera. Those are all sort of, they become, and then the pool hall.
And the pool hall. Yeah.
They're all places that become settings for countless scenes through all of these books, but you're
Yeah.
starting to use them here. Were you consciously setting up your set pieces, or was this just a natural progression?
Well, yeah, I looked at the town.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and when I started The Village Within and started to explore the town, it flowered in the novel because it gave me so much breadth to do that.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, these novels could be placed with the poems as well. The Point Edward poems, because all the same places appear.
Yeah, God's Geography, I think, is the best example of that.
Yeah.
But you absolutely but you're basically starting to set up these places that I've become so attached to through all the novels that it's interesting to see those seeds start to germinate.
Yeah, and they germinated in my head in the summer of 1970, just sitting in the backyard.
Yeah.
And I wrote this thing straight out in about 6 weeks.
Really?
Oh yeah, I just wrote furiously, and your grandma can tell you I was laughing as I was writing it.
Yeah.
I was finding it that funny as I was writing it and thinking, oh, I don't know what this is, but it's talking about my village in the way I wanted to talk about it.
Mm-hmm.
And started to in those early poems, but I really love Bus Ride. When I reread it, I thought, in a way, that's the village I was talking about, both the universal and the particular, that it gets both of those.
Yeah.
And gives the reader a good ride along the way.
Absolutely. Now, the other thing I want to just quickly touch on is you're letting, so you do work with that omniscient narrator, but a lot of the time you're setting up the action of the story, and these are what in your novels I call off-camera elements, where you have scenes that have happened, but the character you're looking through the lens of did not experience it, and so it's through a secondary narrator. They get things explained to them by their dialogue.
By the dialogue, and that was a point we ought to make, is that it's 80% dialogue. And
This is what I was about to say.
8 years later, earlier, I couldn't write a word of dialogue. But you know how that happened?
How's that?
I heard an interview with Alice Munro on the radio.
Right.
And the interviewer asked her, "Your dialogue is wonderful. How do you do it?" And she said, "I don't write dialogue.
Yeah.
What I do is I write two characters,
Mm-hmm.
I put them in a room,
Mm-hmm.
and they talk to one another."
Right.
And that's what I did. And I have ever since found dialogue the absolutely easiest part of a novel to write.
You let the characters drive the content.
Yeah. So that once I got the Reeves character, his little quips and one-liners and so on just come out as I go along.
It really is amazing to see the starts of all of this. Now you mentioned Bill, who's our protagonist.
Right.
He's inspired by your father.
Inspired by my dad's story, yeah.
Any other elements you put into him, or was it mainly just your dad?
Well, what I tried to do is to show all the way through
Mm-hmm.
his frustrations and his misreadings of life around him in the small town.
Yep.
So that takes up a good part of the novel, as he complains again and again, and especially when he gets on the bus and he ends up having to drive the bus, and he's got a wounded hand.
Mm-hmm. Wounded ankle, I
And
think, too, by the end.
So he got kicked in the leg by one of the women.
Yeah.
And even after all of that, I love the way the novel ends myself, even though it doesn't have a great denouement, is the bus comes in
Mm-hmm.
and stops at the only gas pump in the entire town,
Mm-hmm.
which was near the ice cream parlor I pointed out to you when we went our little tour. It's on the corner of the two main streets.
Yeah.
And it used to have one of the old-fashioned gas pumps
Mm-hmm.
with a big glass bubble on top of it.
Yes.
And you pump the gas up into these graduated bubbles,
Mm-hmm.
and then gravity took it down into the car, and that's where they pull up, and then the novel just slows down, and everybody goes home, and it's all been a dream.
And it all sort of dissolves into soft focus at the end, which
That's
is
a good way of putting it. Yes.
because this sort of brings us to, well, this is I think it's the real strength of this novel, and you can tell me whether you think this, but it really is about 80 pages of setup to this bus ride, which to give a brief explanation, it's basically half the town on a city bus trying to get through a snowstorm. That's how it's described at one point, is this municipal bus with half the town aboard. But the main thing I'm interested in about this part of this novel is how frenetic the writing gets. I can sort of feel how feverish your writing must have been.
I was writing it just as fast as I could possibly write, and I've written all my novels on yellow lined paper with a 35-cent ballpoint pen, and I write every other line so I can revise, and then I go back through and revise. I do one revision in red or green, interlinear. Or if there are sections to be added, I say insert A or insert B. And then it goes on to whatever typing in those days it would have been a typewriter, but it's a typed version. The advantage of a computer is that you can revise as you type.
Yes.
So I think there probably would have been a little more smoothness to the writing in Bus Ride if I'd had it on the computer. There would have been probably a lot of minor editing. But no, once I got into that bus ride, a friend of mine said, "There's so much snow in this book."
Yeah.
And of course that's the other great Canadian theme. We've got hockey, but we've got the weather. We've got snowstorms, and the snow comes back into the second volume as well.
Well, and the winter is almost a character in the malice it exudes over the proceedings. The snow is really a malevolent being in this book.
Yeah, and they all crash into it.
Yeah, and it causes horrible problems.
Well, as I was rereading it this morning, I love the way, I hadn't thought about this for a while, in which all of the characters, even the scout, gets involved in the bus ride and the crashing, and they pick up Ben Shaver, the barber who'd fled with this girl,
was lost in the snow.
Lost in the snow, and he wouldn't come out of the car.
Yes.
And I said, "Let him freeze to death."
Yes, and so this whole section is probably 20 pages, maybe, but I can feel the fever pitch with which it was written, and I think this is, like, one of the things I've noticed about your work is you tend to have a measured pace no matter what. I think Summer's Idol is the best example of a rock solid, just steady pacing.
Right.
And it works in that vignette style, which you hadn't landed on yet in this book.
No, I haven't. Not at all, no.
This is much more of a straight-ahead narrative,
Yeah.
which brings us to... this is actually a natural way to segue to All in Good Time, but I guess my first the question I always ask you is, how did it feel rereading Bus Ride? Was there anything you noticed? Was there anything you really liked?
Yeah, I liked. I found that the setup was necessary, but was not exciting reading. But if the reader kept on going and hit that bus ride scene, well, it starts to get interesting in the hockey game.
Yes.
And again the with Danilchuk and Bill having to prove himself and constantly making mistakes and being embarrassed and wanting to get out of all of this. And then you hit the bus ride, and then I loved reading. I'd planned to scroll through it, but I reread the whole bus ride sequence.
Well, and that was what I did too. Like I had one full read of the book, and then I reread the bus ride.
And I like the songs. I like. I thought I don't remember knowing all of those songs.
Yeah.
But they just popped up as I was writing.
Yeah.
When I needed a ditty, I found a little ditty and put it in there. Yeah.
Yeah, it's really amazing, and that. I mean, from my perspective, that's one of the real strengths of this book is you're starting to build those characters and starting to build that sort of sense picture that by the end of these novels is so clean and clear and coalesced.
Well, the original title was Where the Village Ends.
Yep.
And the Nairn Publishing, a little local group that did the book for me, did a very good job. Sold 1,000 copies of it. But they didn't like that title, and I agreed with them that so I said, what are you going to call it? And they said, well, we'll just call it Bus Ride because that's what it's about. And I said, okay, we'll call it Bus Ride.
Yeah.
So they chose the title.
Well, it works.
Yeah, it worked.
So, by way of segue, All in Good Time came in 1979 and is a sequel to Bus Ride.
Mm-hmm.
What were you doing in the interim? What made you decide to write the sequel?
You may have noticed that in God's Geography, most of the poetry is reworked and from earlier poems.
Yep.
From The Village Within and Lambton County.
Mm-hmm.
Because I had run out of gas.
Yeah.
By 1980, I thought, I've written myself out. Not only have I written those 4 epics, but I've written my Lambton County poem as well in that book.
Yep.
And I just, for the first time in my life, stopped writing poetry.
Oh, okay.
So I thought, well, maybe I'm a novelist. I've written one novel. It got good reviews. It was quite successful.
Right.
So that's the way I work. Is I'm always on the lookout for projects, and I thought, well, what would happen if I built the novel All in Good Time around the Governor General's visit?
Mm-hmm.
Because the Governor General Alexander visited Point Edward
Yep.
in March of 1945.
Right.
Alexander had just been made Governor General. He was a famous general in the Desert War, in the Second World War.
In Africa?
Yeah, in
Okay.
Africa.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, in the Desert War in Africa, and he was famous as a general, and so they made him Governor General, and he did a little tour, and for some reason Point Edward was on the tour. I don't, as I say, you never know with these local politicians whose back was slapped or whatever it was. But I have I was only 8 at the time, but I have a general memory of the crowd around the monument.
And so he visited what I would call it the cenotaph, but it's that monument.
Yeah, we call it the monument.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which is across the way from Lily Fairchild's residence.
Her house, her little house, yeah.
Yeah, and so and he really did visit there.
He really did, yeah.
That was one of the questions I was going to ask you.
Yeah.
So that sums that up nicely for me. And you somewhat remember it.
And I somewhat remember it, yeah. I have a general memory of it, yeah.
Cool. This was your first wartime novel. And you
definitely, yeah. Once we're up into 1944 and the winter of 44-45, you're definitely in the war.
I sort of see this. I mean, I see All in Good Time as the direct precursor to Summer's Idle and Winter's Descent in a couple of ways that I will describe to you. But it's grittier. It's not, because it's through the eyes of adults as opposed to the eyes of kids. There's a lot more of the sort of the gritty reality of wartime, the privations.
Yeah.
But the one thing I wanted to see whether you see what you think about is this is the start of you writing your prose in vignettes, or it looks like to me.
Yeah.
Because I can't think of any before this.
No, not before that. No, not at all. No.
Was that something, did that represent an evolution in your writing style, or?
Yes, it did, yeah.
How did you get into doing that?
Well, again, I wanted to create a whole village and people it. There must be 15 or 20 characters in that novel.
Yeah.
And I wanted to give them a little space, and so they some of them appear in little vignettes of only 5 or 6 lines.
Yeah.
But I wanted to flesh out the village.
Right.
And because it's an adult novel, I call it a coming of middle age novel.
Yeah, that fits.
Again, the Reeve wants to get out of his life. it's a typical middle age crisis.
Yep.
He's not happy with his life. He, like Bill, he wants to get out and do something else to make some kind of mark. And so it was an adult novel, and so I peopled it with other adults.
Right.
And a couple of hockey-playing youngsters, the Fred Underhill, the two younger Underhill boys from the first novel.
Yep.
But no, it's a. I wanted to again write a village novel with representative characters from right across the whole spectrum of the village. That's why you have the immigrant community, because we had an immigrant community,
Right.
and they were wiped out during that terrible sit-down strike.
Yes.
That's exactly, every word in that is exactly true.
Yeah.
I got it from Ontario History Magazine, and it had the whole thing laid out there in great detail. And so it even has and they appear as a chorus during the hockey game.
Yes.
They're down at one end with their particular accented chants, and then the other people, and they are also their ancestors were in Potts Lane in Lily's story.
Yes. Yes, because that's it. Interestingly enough, I was wondering about that.
They settled in there.
Because you see some of because this chronologically, this is after Lily's story, but in the chronology of when you wrote all of these things, these are well before you ever wrote Lily's story.
In fact, I even, that's right. And I invented Potts Lane as a down and out habitation.
Kind of Skid Row-ish.
That's the term, Skid Row-ish. That's right. And in fact, I changed the spelling, because in Lily, it's Potts, Potts is their name, with the apostrophe after it.
Yep.
And I just noticed when I was looking at All in Good Time this morning that I'd spelled it the other way.
Yeah. Interesting. So this is, I mean, one thing I want to quickly touch on, because there's a lot to talk about in this book. Content-wise, I guess I don't find the story in this one as compelling as some of the others, but I think the thing that's striking about it is the character development.
Yeah, it doesn't have a strong central narrative, does it?
No, and I don't think that's necessarily a problem, but I think it just lets us start to see the richness of those characters you're starting to build. And the thing I like about it, but I find hard about it, is this is where you start to explore some of the themes you explore further in Summer's Idol and Winter's Descent, which is the troubled, dark past of a lot of these people living in this town. I think his name Tom, that's having Great War flashbacks throughout the book.
Oh, yeah, right.
You're starting to touch on some of these darker themes that you explore later. Were you, like, was there I guess what I'm trying to ask is, did you like feel that, or were you trying to capture anything specific by including these sort of tumultuous past histories for these characters?
Only that I wanted it to be a dark comedy with a lot of pathos in it. And because that's been one of the strong feelings of my writing life, and it fully comes out in Lily's story.
Right.
I think about, because I'm interested in Canadian history and always have been, I think about the hardness of the lives of the people who came before us.
Yeah.
And how lucky we are that we live in the Canada that we do today. And I wanted to honor them by, even though it's sad and they feel stricken sometimes, their stories need to be told.
Absolutely. Well, and that's, I think, one of the strengths of a lot of these of this body of work, if we take them all together, is that you're telling stories and providing narratives for uncomfortable parts of Canadian history that too often we tend not to think about because maybe they're not all that pleasant.
Right.
Maybe they don't have that hero narrative we seem to always want.
Yeah.
But they're still valuable.
Yeah.
This one is, I think that, you know, in Bus Ride, you're starting to develop the characters of the point. There are many in there.
Yeah.
This one is where I first start to get that feel that I get in the later books of this vast cast of local characters.
Yeah.
And we've talked about this a little bit before, but when you were modeling these Point Edward characters for this period of time, you were modeling them on people you remembered.
Yeah. And I remembered, yeah.
Were you using memory exercises at this point? Or was that something that you came to later?
Probably not in the same focused way that I did with the poetry.
Right.
But I certainly, when I was creating the town characters, I was thinking of the grocer and the postman and the fire chief and the policeman in particular.
Yep.
And the Reeve, of course. The barber, Breezy Harkness, one of my favorite characters. I mean, he is a piece of work.
And he shows back up in Bewilderment, too.
Oh, that's right, Breezy does.
He does. We'll get to that.
Yeah.
I mean, it's where you start to flesh out a lot of these characters because your narration is largely first person, but we pick up story elements from these people talking to each other.
Yeah.
And that helps to, that builds character more than any amount of exposition
I think so.
can.
I think well, that's why I think dialogue is the heart of most really good fiction. There are exceptions, of course, but no, that's how Alice Munro did it. I mean, she could have a half page of dialogue, and there's a whole little universe in it. She just does it so beautifully and so powerfully, and that's what I got from her. And I thought, if I'm going to be a novelist, I have to master dialogue, and the only way to do it is to close my eyes and think, here is the Reeve. This is what he looks like. This is what he's going to say in a given situation. And I go ahead and write it.
So let's talk about the Reeve for a second. So he's a peripheral character, not a peripheral. He's a main character in Bus Ride. What gave you the idea that you wanted to use him as your protagonist in this book?
Well, because I find him a comic character. Yeah. And when I wrote him in Bus Ride, and I thought. I wanted to write a middle-aged coming-of-age novel. That was the theme.
Right.
And a similar theme to Bus Ride in that the Reeve wants to get out, but he ends up coming back and accepting the village as it is. So in a way, the two novels are really quite related. The All in Good Time is not as strong a novel as Bus Ride because. There are too many pieces to it, and I didn't quite get the narrative drive or the narrative arc that I really needed to make it a strong novel. But for people who simply like a character study novel, they probably would certainly enjoy this.
Well, and I think it works really well in the context of all your other work. But you're right. There's a lot of moving parts, and it's very fragmented.
Very fragmented, yeah.
So I don't get that sense of frenetic pace that I would have gotten previously.
No.
But it's still...
There's a bit of it in The Riot.
Yes.
My favorite line in The Riot is, across the way someone ripped the banner lengthwise.
Yeah.
And that's what you were alluding to earlier. My comedy is more just little turns of wit rather than farce.
Well, exactly. It's all situational. And the thing that I love about your prose, and I was just reading an essay that David Foster Wallace wrote just a little while ago, and he was talking about, I forget what it's his study on the topic of prose poetry, and he has a lot to say on it. But the one thing he talks about is what he calls the primary sin of expository prose, and that is forgetting who the narrative's for, where the author is indulging themselves. And the thing I love about your work is you do care what the reader is picking up, and you're building jokes for them to enjoy, but you have to have paid attention for the humor to really ramify.
To work, yeah. I hadn't thought it in those terms. That's quite perceptive, yeah.
Yeah, and I think you don't lose track of making sure the reader stays engaged while still indulging that urge to build these rich characters.
Rich characters, yeah.
No, it's All in Good Time's a great book. I think I land where you do in that I don't think it's as narratively strong as Bus Ride.
No.
But I'm also intrigued by it because there is so much of what comes later starting in this book.
I hadn't thought of it that way, but you're quite right. Now I'll have to start thinking about that and the other two memoir novels. Yeah.
Because as far as structure goes, this is as close to Summer's Idol as you get. Your vignettes are even shorter than in Summer's Idol,
yeah,
and less focused, but it's ultimately the same style of writing.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the thing I think is the most interesting about All in Good Time. What struck you about it on rereading?
I like the characters,
mm-hmm.
and as you said, I found there were a lot of moving parts to it.
Mm-hmm.
But if I slowed down, I enjoyed each part.
Yeah.
I love the riot.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, because that reminded me of Bus Ride. It's a smaller little section than the Bus Ride,
but it's got that frenzy
pace. But it has
pace
that
to it.
Same pace to it,
mm-hmm.
and of course the Rangers, the American hockey team, get on the bus, and the bridge comes into it. I imagine that scene where they go down St. Clair and then through the customs, and then they watch the crowd stands out there and watches it head back.
Yeah, watches them disappear up and over the border.
Yeah, with the obscenity scrawled on the side of the bus.
Mm-hmm.
I love things like that. I mean, but if you ask me how I thought them up, I have no idea. I get into it. When I finally got to the riot, I just thought, well, I'm enjoying myself again. But by that time, I had a cast of characters that I could use.
Absolutely.
And that sort of justifies introducing some of them earlier when they are not as attractive to the reader. But it's setting it up and getting it ready, and then the scene in the barn with the big turnaround and the huge anticlimax to the novel.
Well, and I think when you're trying to set up these big scope, big scale, it's almost like it's a word. Well, it's a word picture, of course, but it's trying to set up this sort of crowning moment of absurd humor.
Yeah.
You have to do a lot of pipe laying to get there because you have to lay all the layers down so that this moment can really hit.
Yeah.
And I get a sense of how you're starting to set everything up. But also, once we get to Bewilderment, you've become more effective at that, I think. And so I think Bewilderment, and we'll talk about it now, is an extremely strong novel that it's clear that you've learned lessons from these first two and applied them. Now, Bewilderment came out, well, All in Good Time 1979, Bewilderment year 2000.
Yeah.
So that's 20 years.
Yeah.
Well, I guess we know you were doing poetry in the interim.
And Lily's story.
And Lily's story.
Yeah.
What germinated to make Bewilderment come around?
I was sitting here one day doing my memory exercises, and I thought, I'd like to write. At this point, I was actually thinking about the whole narrative from 45 right through. And I thought, the only gap is the Depression.
Yep.
And there are so few really good novels of that Depression period that I thought I would like to contribute to that.
Well, there's plenty on the Dust Bowl, but not a lot on Canada.
No.
Like, you've got Grapes of Wrath and everything.
Yeah, and on the prairies and so on. But I thought what would the life be in my small town, Point Edward again?
Mm-hmm.
And I was sitting in this chair and I was thinking, I've got a character.
Mm-hmm.
I want an everyman character.
Yep.
And I'm going to call him Gabriel Goodfellow.
Mm-hmm. Good old Gabe.
Rather obvious name.
Yes.
Angelic Gabe.
The writing's on the wall there.
Yeah, right there, right away.
Yeah.
And I thought, I did what I always do. I sat down with my pad,
mm-hmm.
and I wrote the first 9 or 10 pages.
Yep.
Him walking home.
Yep.
And I had the whole village map in my head, and I had him going up and down the streets, and I knew exactly, his home was exactly where ours was, at 208 Alexander.
I picked that up.
You picked that
I picked that up.
right up there.
Yep.
And, of course, it's his mother's house. He
mm-hmm.
couldn't afford a house of his own, but his mother left him this house.
Mm-hmm.
And then I thought, I'm going to build it around Gabe, who has an idea of how to help his town during the Depression years when people were so low all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's when the carnival idea came into my head.
Yes.
I'm going to have him go to the authorities and suggest a carnival.
Mm-hmm.
And then, I don't know where this came from, I thought he's going to get the idea from a group of gypsies.
Yep.
So I read 3 books on gypsy life, on
mm-hmm.
Roma life,
yep.
Roma life. And so I thought I knew it's a dangerous topic to do and probably would not get the book published.
Yeah, sure.
People just don't have the courage anymore to
It's a tap dance in a minefield.
Yeah, tap dancing in a minefield. So I knew that when I wrote it, but I thought, I read 3 books on them. I'm going to be absolutely honest about their lives as they were in the 30s when they were travelers
mm-hmm.
and tinsmiths.
Mm-hmm.
That was the way they made their living.
Yep.
Sharpening knives and all of that sort of thing.
Yep.
And so I invented Sophia and Papa Malkovich.
Mm-hmm.
And had Gabe run into them as the first inciting incident of the book.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, I had to create a townsfolk around Gabe. And this time I was too far back to use anybody from the other 2 novels except Breezy,
mm-hmm.
who's been the barber for all time.
Yep.
I agree with you that I think this is a very strong novel,
mm-hmm.
even though it didn't go anywhere, didn't get any reviews. But when I looked at all 3 of them, which you asked me to do, I thought, I love bus riding. I love things about All in Good Time.
Mm-hmm.
But in terms of just a solid novel
mm-hmm.
That has a tone that doesn't change, that is consistent in its point of view and tone all the way through.
Consistent pacing, a really strong overlying narrative.
Mm-hmm. And a narrative that has some creativity in it. I had him be chosen to go down to London.
Yep.
And that's a very accurate description of the little underground that used to be before they built the new station. You used to have to go underground to get to the trains.
Yeah.
And then he goes out to East Dundas Street to that would have been fields out there.
Yes.
They're suburbs now.
Yep.
And he finds the little carnival set up, and he meets the gypsies again, and it turns out that they are going to produce the carnival for him.
He's at UWO at one point too, isn't he? Or someone is at UWO in that book. Or perhaps there's just people from UWO in that book. It certainly gets mentioned.
Oh, yeah, Rennie.
Yes.
Rennie's going to a conference, a socialist conference.
Yes! That's what it is.
And he's reading the CCF manifesto.
Yes.
And, it's a solid novel in that sense. There are fewer characters, but they're well grounded, well developed. Rosie and Rennie, I liked them when I read. Aunt Vi as a character, and she's based on a couple of my Aunt Vi, my great Aunt Vi, and another woman named M. Leckie, who were characters like that, strong women, bossy women.
Well, and M comes, a version of that character makes a return in Winter's Descent.
Exactly, same one. And
essentially the same character,
the same source.
Yes,
the same character.
You do have a few of your archetypes that you'll see in a few of them, and that's one of them. That's sort of the sassy, early model liberated woman. I honestly, as far as the Roma stuff goes, I think you handled it really sensitively. To be honest, I get that it's a hard topic to nail.
It is.
But I think you did a good job of not slipping into what people would consider the tropes or stereotypes about Roma.
Right.
Because it is a fascinating world, and they too don't get maybe the publicity they deserve, or perhaps get too much negative publicity sometimes. But I think you handled that very sensitively.
And they take part of the money, but only because the town cheated them.
Yes.
By putting in other stalls and taking their profits away from them.
Well, and it's an interesting reversal in that the gypsies are the straight dealers, and the townsfolk or the municipal people are the crooks.
Yeah.
It's a neat inversion. Now, Gabe Goodfellow, which it's just right in the name what you need to know about Gabe Goodfellow. I sort of see similarities in how you narrate using Gabe, in that these are what I call your off-camera elements, where there are things happening in the town that Gabe does not witness.
Right.
But the plot is advanced when it is described to him by somebody else.
Okay, I hadn't thought of that, but you're right.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like you're building the plot, but you're not doing a lot of exposition.
No.
When you visualized how the plot looks, do you have sort of you see how the plot looks and then you filter it through Gabe, or do you, like, what is your process to get such a big story across through dialogue? That's a big question, I know, but it to me is fascinating.
Well, I don't make plot outlines.
Oh, okay.
But I knew how the novel was going to end. I knew that I wanted the image of Gabe riding on the back of a coal truck.
Yep.
For the final sort of irony in this dark. I consider this a dark comedy. Comedy in the old-fashioned sense of things turning out well at the end, but not has one comic scene in it. But the rest of it is the old-fashioned, what Fry would call comedy.
Yes.
And what I do is I build it block by block. I think the reader needs to know something about what Breezy's doing. So there'll be a scene with Breezy and somebody else. This is what you're talking about. And the machinations of the politicians and so on. Again, to show the contrast with Gabe's honesty and straightforwardness and so on. He's surrounded by these slippery characters.
Yeah, there are some all-time slimy characters in this one.
And I love Blossom. I thought she was a good creation. I love the character of Blossom.
Very well realized. Now, the one thing that struck me about this book, and it strikes me about all of these sort of the period pieces. I just have to pause this. There we are. Something that struck me more about this book than a lot of the other ones is the names are just fantastic. There are so many hilarious names in this book. I just wrote a couple out. Skip Hargreaves, Foster Brine, Breezy Harkness, as we mentioned, Stubby Birch. These names are... I get so much joy from them.
I come from a town of nicknames. I mean, everybody, if you were tall, you were Long Tom Shaw. Mm-hmm. And if you were short, you were Shorty.
And so that gets to, like, where do these names come from? Is it literally just you'll remember a last name, or... Because they just seem so out there at times that I trouble understanding where they come from.
No, I wish I did too.
Yeah.
But I'm looking for a character.
Yeah.
And it's the same when we get to the mysteries. There are a lot of really good character names in the mysteries as well. But no, I think of the nicknames from the hometown, like Rip Kemsley and Long Tom Shaw, and Silent George, who never stopped talking.
Yep.
And what would happen is that how these names were given to them is a mystery to me.
Yep.
But my dad and two uncles, where my dad was Gubsy,
Yeah.
and Uncle Bob was Potsy, and Uncle Tom was Iggy.
Huh.
A name which he despised and soon got rid of. But
Yeah.
Potsy kept his.
Potsy was from Marbles, right?
Yeah.
Playing marbles? Isn't that where the name comes from?
Yeah, Potsy. Yeah, that's right. That's where he would have got that, probably playing. But they probably started in school, in the schoolyards.
Yeah.
We had when I moved to Chatham as a teenager, there was one kid in the neighborhood who gave nicknames to all the other kids in the subdivision. He was the one who handed them out, and he made them popular by saying them over and over again.
Yep.
My nickname was Gramps because I dressed as a old grandpa hobo for Halloween, and he called me Gramps thereafter.
Really?
And that was my nickname.
Interesting.
And, yeah. So there's somebody in the town was going around, and often an uncle or a relative would, when the kid is growing up, would stick a nickname on him, and it would stick with the family, and the family would adopt the nickname. And I'm sure the teachers didn't use them, but they...
Because it's remarkable how many of your characters have these kind of names when we get through all of the novels. Yeah. And it's more, and you see it more with the kids, of course.
Yeah.
But this novel really struck me. There was a higher than average number of amusing nicknames in this one. When you read over Bewilderment, and we've sort of touched on this, but I think it represents a progression in your novel writing. Absolutely.
I think I do too.
What do you like about it?
As I read the three novels, I thought I really finally learned to write a novel. There's nothing I don't like about Bewilderment. And the people who have read it, friends of mine and supporters, they love the novel. It just... And my friend Eric Wood said, well, surely you could get a major publisher. This is really good stuff. And I said, no, I can't. I sent it to half a dozen publishers. This was before I had an agent. And if I'd had an agent, I might have got it published.
Right.
But no, I that was my feeling. I finally learned to write a novel, even though the two memoir novels I like very much as well. But in terms of writing a village novel that works in every way, I thought I like this.
Yeah, it's a great one. To me, it's if we're compiling a must-read list of yours, this would have to be on there. The one thing I wanted to touch on a little bit, you mentioned it, was that you were published by Borealis, who's a smaller press, But really, you feel like, I think you were telling me that it really was not promoted in any way.
Not at all. They sold 60 copies of it.
Yeah, and
didn't get a single review. They didn't even send it out for review, I learned later. They didn't even bother. What happens is that these are two university professors have run this for years, and they rely on grants.
Right.
And they love to publish. They do beautiful books. They do beautiful covers. One of them is a designer. He loves the covers, and so on. But they don't spend any money on promoting it. At least you could send it out to reviews.
They're just not driven by sales.
They're just not driven by sales. There's nothing to drive them. They're completely funded by both the Ontario and the national government. So there's no incentive to.
Right.
So that was
It's
a disappointment, because I did think at the time that it was a very good novel, but the first little memoir novel is going to be reprinted this spring.
Yes, I heard that. Summer's Idle.
Yeah, Summer's Idle is going to be reprinted by Black Moss, and
Great.
he will send it out. He's hoping to get the Toronto Star to review it, because they reviewed several of his books in the past. But and at least he'll get it out to libraries.
Yep.
And I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah, that'll be great. And so Grandpa and I think one of our very first discussions we ever had was on Summer's Idle. And I think
first one.
I think that was the one that didn't survive the editing process because our sound levels were all off. So Grandpa and I have since talked about it again.
Yeah.
But it's I mean, I unabashedly say it's my favorite Summer's Idle, but getting to know these other novels has been a great experience for me. And I think Bewilderment is among the best. Well, that brings us to the last thing I wanted to talk with you about today. Is Bewilderment fills the last gap in a century of Point Edward. So Lily Fairchild picks up in 1845.
1845. Oh, that's right. It's an even 100.
It's a century.
I hadn't thought of that.
Yeah. Yeah, so Lily Fairchild, Lily's story starts in 1845, and the final events of Winter's Descent are in 1945.
Yeah.
So that takes you through 100 years of Lambton County, and Point Edward's whole existence in those years. Were you intending to do that in any way, or did it just happen?
When I did Lily's story, I thought consciously, I'm going to go back to the beginning.
Yep.
And, of course, Point Edward didn't start till 1869. But I once I got my character Lily and written that first chapter out in the pioneer world of Moore Township, I had to go back to 1845 and work my way up to 1869, and from there on you get the whole history of Point Edward to pretty much to 1945. So that was a conscious decision at that time to fill in a gap.
Yeah.
And then later on, this would be a lot later, 15 years later, in 2000, I thought there's only one area I haven't done. And there hasn't been a good Depression novel about a small town.
Yep.
And the kind of sufferings that they have. And I think the Depression comes through well, don't you, in the book?
It's grimy.
Yeah.
You can feel the grime on everything, and you can feel the soot in the sky, that's for sure. Yeah. No, absolutely, I think it comes through. And it's that atmosphere building that I think you really excel at in all these books.
Yeah.
But I think maybe Bewilderment is the strongest for the atmosphere it provides. And I think it's just at your evolution as a writer. I mean, by then you had all these experiences to draw upon that.
Yeah.
And you would have been into Mark Edwards by that point, right?
Mark Edwards starts about the first two were published in 2003.
Right.
I can't get the information because it's all in the archives, but my guess would be I started after Bewilderment in 2001, 2002.
Okay.
Because I know what I was thinking then.
Mm-hmm.
After Bewilderment, that's it.
Yeah.
That's
no
it.
more Point?
There are no more Point Edward novels anyway. There may be poems, but there will be no more novels and no more literary novel writing. I had no other topics.
Yep.
So then I sat around for a year, probably wrote a few poems and said, I've read 400 mysteries. Why don't I try writing one? And that's how that started.
This is something that you and I will have to talk about as well, because the progression into mystery became, it was your primary project, but prior to that, it was The Point.
Yeah, The Point.
So this is the question that I can't find an elegant way to ask it, but I'm just gonna put this out there and we'll see what you think. Clearly, Point Edward is a guiding principle in a lot of work and a central theme for you in a lot of the work clearly that you're proud of, and the work that I love that tends to revolve around the Point. After coasting through all this material with me, starting with The Village Within, ending at Bewilderment, what does it mean to you? Like, what do you get from it? What were you hoping for? What came of it?
Well, when you write something, even if it's just a poem about Point Edward, you want the reader to feel something, to feel it fully and wholly. And of course, that's an unreachable goal as a writer. You can't tell everything.
Yeah.
But I've had this lifelong urge to tell everything about Point Edward that I knew. I just wrote a poem about it yesterday, another one. It just keeps going, and because the vacuum is never filled.
Yeah.
And so I've been very lucky as a writer, because lots of writers write 3 or 4 novels, very wonderful novels that win prizes, and then you don't hear anything more from them. They're written out, and Margaret Lawrence was written out. She said, I'll never write another novel.
Yep.
Because I've used up all my experience, because that's what we're doing when we're writing. The novelists I admire are the ones like Lawrence and Monroe who use their life experience and pour it into their work.
Yeah.
And why I'm not a fan of Margaret Atwood, because she's what I call an intellectual writer. You don't get the powerful feelings in her novel. But then people go to novels for different reasons. I go to them to get the feeling, the full feeling of something that's been at least attempted to be completed.
Yeah. And more visceral as opposed to cerebral.
And more visceral as opposed to cerebral. No, nobody would ever accuse me of being a cerebral writer.
Cerebral writing's boring anyway. Do you think you've succeeded? Have you accomplished what you were going for?
You've convinced me that I have. You really have.
You think?
I mean, because here I am still whittling away at little poems and so on. So I still think I'm working the mind, as I say to my friends. That vein is still being mined. But no, you've convinced me that there's a body of work out there, which I can be proud. Good.
Well, that's. I am certainly proud of it. So I am glad to hear that you are too. I think you. There's certainly a prevailing aesthetic to the Point Edward work, and I think it's valuable, and I think it holds up to scrutiny, and it's one of the reasons that I've enjoyed this process, is that I have a richer understanding of it now than I ever did before.
Yeah. And you've seen the funny little village that produced all of this.
Yes, well, and if we accomplish nothing else through making these, if we get someone to go and have a look around Point Edward and try and think about what it might have been like in those days, I think a little walking tour and a couple of these books give you a pretty good sense of what that strange little place in time would have been.
Would have been a few streets, a wharf, a beach,
and that giant bridge. This was the thing that struck me walking around Point Edward, was just the bridge is just everywhere.
Bridge is everywhere, yeah.
You can't look over your shoulder without the bridge being there. And
I could see it out of my bedroom window when I was a toddler.
It's Yeah, I really think you've done an admirable job capturing the town, and I of course enjoy these works, and they hold up to rereading because I get more out of them every time. The other thing that I think is so great, other than a painting the picture of the town, and I guess part of it is, like as we've discussed many times, your cast of characters is so rich by the end of this that I find myself seeing shades of these characters reflected in many people, but they're all fascinating. This is going to be a hard question for you, but do you have a favorite character, or do you have some that are your favorites?
Well, the
And just to be clear, they can be a fictional character, an inspired character, a real person.
no, of all the fictional characters, Gabe Goodfellow is the one that I am closest to, because I see more of myself in him. Because I was very shy growing up, and certainly would not have been bold enough to do what he did. But Goodfellow, and some of the characters in Summer's Idol are my favorites, like Wiz and and Will in those books. Less so in Bus Ride. Bus Ride is more of a comedy, but I'm not close to Bill. I wrote Bill because I wanted to, and I had to because of the way I had designed the book in my head. But he doesn't come across as a character as rich as, say, Blossom or Gabe Goodfellow or even Rosie or Ray.
Yeah, or even some of the kids from Summer's Idol and Winter's Descent. They become
Hutch and Bones and Joey.
They become dear to your heart as time goes on.
Yeah.
I guess just to give you a sense of where my favorites are, I am a huge fan of Cap Harness and Cap Garvey. Now, Garvey was the one that cut hair, or was that Harness?
That was Harness.
Harness was the hair cutter that hadn't been on the sea.
That's right.
And Garvey was the one that came in from the storm in the 20s.
That's right, yeah.
Those two are my favorite sort of peripheral, just because they're so interesting between the two of them. I really love Wiz. I think he's, I of course love Will because he's the protagonist and he's the semi-autobiographical portion of the novel. I find Wiz to be, he's someone I wish I'd met. That's the part. And so Grandpa recently let me know that he had, you had found Wiz's obituary from when he passed away. It would have been in the 60s or something like that?
No, when he was in his 60s.
When he was in his 60s.
Yeah, when he was in his 60s. Yes, I misled you on that.
Well, it seemed like he would have been
But he was
rather
very young. That was my thought. It was quite a while ago that he died, and I thought, my word.
And so Grandpa's actually just written another poem about Wiz. So the well is not dry yet. No, but Wiz is a great character. I think he's one of my favorites, and I really like Lily as well.
Yeah, of course I forgot. I forgot about Lily because we haven't mentioned her very much today, but she certainly is one of my most fully drawn characters because she goes on for 286,000 words.
Yeah.
I mean, if you had told me that I would write a novel of that length, and with every scene involving, well, not every, but 95% of the scenes involving Lily, there are a few where there are stories told to her and so on, but she's even listening to them, so she's there in every single scene. I wouldn't have believed you.
Yeah. Well, and that was one of the things that's so ambitious about Lily's story, right? Is the scope of it is so much larger than any of the others, and it covers, of course, the most time.
Right.
So I guess the one thing that I think, and this is, I guess, just my takeaway, I think the characters that speak to me the most when I look at the whole thing is, I think it has to be the boys from Summer's Idol.
Yeah, you love them, don't you?
That is what I love the most. And I think it's a little bit reflective of, it's my biases and the fact that Summer's Idol is my favorite of your work. So those are my favorite character, that group of boys. how do they rank for you as an author? How do you feel about them?
Well, I feel strongly about it because I've even written poems about them, which tells you that they are still in my imagination.
Mm-hmm.
And no, I love creating them. Again, that book wrote itself.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason, I mean, I shouldn't probably say this, but the reason it's in little segments like that is that I wrote it in odd moments while I was at work, and
Yes.
occasionally when I would come home from work, I'd sit down and write one scene.
Right.
And then a possible arc or plot evolves from the early first few chapters or first few vignettes.
Right.
And then I had two narrative arcs in that story that carried it through.
Right.
But it was written that way in little scenes.
Mm-hmm.
And whereas Bus Ride, I sat down and wrote and wrote and wrote and wrote and
Wrote it end to end.
and never took a breather.
Right. Well, this is the other question that I think will be hard for you to answer, but maybe it won't be. What's your favorite? Which is your favorite of these novels?
Oh, golly.
I think I know, but...
No, I'd say Summer's Idol.
Yeah?
Yeah.
I thought it would have been Lily's story.
No. You brought me around to Summer's Idol.
Good.
I would have said Lily's story before we started, simply because I put so much energy into it, and I put so much energy into it recently in promoting and trying to get it read.
Yep.
And so on. But no, I love Summer's Idol, and I'm delighted it's going to be redone.
That's, I think, of all the good news we've gotten on the professional front, that's been the best news of this past year, because I think it's the one that, if I had to choose one of your novels to say this is what you should read, I think it would have to be Summer's Idol.
Yeah, because again, they would get the village, they'd get my play with characterization, and a little humor here and there, the odd little witticism here and there. So quite a bit of what I am is encompassed in that little book.
It captures it all well, I think.
Yeah.
And I think that's probably why it ranks as my favorite. On our journey back through all of this, and we can think about specifically these novels, I mean, but on this journey back through your work, is there anything that struck you that did you have anything revelatory, or was it just nice to revisit old friends like this?
I was surprised, really, when I reread Bus Ride and All in Good Time,
Mm-hmm.
that they held up so well. Bus Ride was my first novel.
Yeah.
And I must admit, I went back to it a few weeks ago when we first organized this part of the project,
Mm-hmm.
with some trepidation,
Yeah.
because I thought, this is a first novel. There's going to be flaws in it.
Mm-hmm.
So I read the reviews, and I got some very good reviews. So I thought, I've got a few people who liked it.
Yeah.
But I was surprised that instead of scrolling through it, I just kept stopping and reading.
Yeah. No, that's... I sort of feel that way too. It was a lot of reading to get through,
Yeah.
but it was very captivating.
Yeah, that surprised me, was how many words were in it. We didn't have a word count in those days on the computer.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't, but it in the format it's in, they're big pages with fairly concise font. So that it's probably, it could well be 125 or 130,000 words.
Oh, absolutely.
And the little mysteries you'll find easy to read, they're 70,000 words.
Yeah, they're a breeze by comparison.
Yeah.
Is there anything I've missed? Is there anything about these novels and your journey through them again that I've failed to pick up on that you think is worth drawing people's attention to?
No, I thought there would be.
Yeah.
No, we've covered a tremendous ground,
Mm-hmm.
and I think we've done justice to each of the individual novels as we've gone along.
Absolutely.
Perhaps we could have, if we'd had a little more time, we could have talked a little more about the plotting in Bewilderment,
Mm-hmm.
of which I'm really quite quite pleased the way
Yeah.
the plot was and that. But no, we've covered the ground, and I've got to tell you about my village, which is why I've written all these things.
Yeah. Well, and I love that we get a chance to share that with people. And as far as the finding the little bits and pieces of how the plots of these books fit together and all of that, that's something that I just hope we'll get people to read these books.
That's right. We don't need to pull them apart, do we?
Well, and that was never, and I think we've done an admirable job of, I think I went into the first thing we ever recorded saying the idea wasn't ever to microanalyze these books.
Exactly.
It's more to talk around them and just to hope people will pick them up.
Yeah.
So, Don Gutteridge's newest release. Now, The Sands of Canatera is out, but is that something people can buy?
As an ebook.
Okay, so Grandpa's most recent book of poetry is called The Sands of Canatera, just released this year. I've not sure I've even had a read through it yet. Right. That's Blue Flow. There we are. Yep, so Sands of Canatera.
And that's the latest.
Oh, and this is the new one. And so we have Inklings coming out. Oh, wow.
Yeah,
When is this being released, Grandpa?
I've sent you one. I didn't?
Maybe, you know what, let me check.
Yeah, you check on that, and if not, I'll get one for you. I can get Inklings for you. Sands of Canatera. I've got an extra copy, so you can have that.
So I have a copy of this. I'll have to get a copy of Inklings. But so Grandpa's newest book, Inklings, is from Black Moss Press.
Yeah.
Black Moss has done some great work on Grandpa's poetry the past couple of years. So we really, I'm very grateful to Marty Gervais for his support of the work, and I think he's clearly a champion of your work, and I'm glad that you and he are continuing to publish. What's next? What's in the works? You've got more poetry, right?
Yes, I've got a collection of poetry coming out in the fall of 2018. That's next year.
Yep.
Called Miniatures.
Right.
And it's about 40% Point Edward poems and the usual miscellany of things here and there. And then in the fall of 2019, Marty's going to publish Mara's Lamp.
Yes.
Which is entirely about Point Edward. 70 pages of Point Edward poems. And I'm just putting together another 70-page collection of poems, partly about Point Edward and partly about a miscellany of poems. And then eventually, probably in a year or two, I'm going to get around to the Cameron Lake poems.
Yes.
It'll be a tiny little chapbook, but
because that's a topic we have yet to cover too. We've touched on it many times, but Grandpa's Cameron Lake Suite is one of our upcoming podcast topics. I'm looking forward to that. And then as far as Summer's Idol goes, so that's going to be in the spring of 2018. Re-release of Summer's Idol by whom?
Black Moss Press.
By Black Moss. That's great. I'm excited for that. So Grandpa and I will likely record a supplemental of some kind around that release just to get people pointed in that direction. And yeah, I mean, as always, it's been lovely talking to you, Grandpa.
Thank you.
No. I guess I'll stay on by a little longer.
Well, how did everyone enjoy that? I think it was a good one. We certainly had a wide-ranging discussion, hit a lot of different topics, and sort of talked around the books more than directly about them, but maybe that's the best way. We do want the reader to enjoy themselves after all. We were never really in it to microanalyze or try and tease out semiotic meaning or whatever from the work. It was mainly just about enjoying the work and spending some time together. These are works Grandpa cherishes, clearly, and it always, warms my heart to spend some time talking to him about something he so clearly loves. They're excellent novels, and I would suggest any of our listeners pick them up if they haven't read them. They're widely available in the resale market. Amazon is your friend. They're all over there. So, if you're so inclined, please go ahead and pick up a copy of one of Don Gutteridge's novels. Bus Ride, All in Good Time, and Bewilderment, a story of the Great Depression. Or a novel of the Great Depression, my bad. Grandpa also has several books of poetry available from Black Moss Press. They're a really great small publishing house based out of Windsor, and their chief, Marty Gervais, has always been a big supporter of Grandpa's, and we're certainly grateful for all the publications through Black Moss. Check out their website and enjoy. There's lots of great authors over there. Our intro and outro music is provided by Joe Organ, dear friend of the show and dear friend from life. Thanks, Joey. As always, beautiful. Check him out on Bandcamp and SoundCloud, I believe. Currently touring with the Holy Gasp. Joey, thanks, buddy. I guess that's it for us this week on There and Then. Thank you so much for joining us.
Got to go, but you stop me saying no, no, no. I guess I'll stay on by.